Bourbon over headlines.
Welcome everybody. Welcome to Bourbon Over Headlines, where your headlines are served neat. Today, we're staying in that central Midwestern pocket. We're going to Council Bluffs. We're going to Iowa. That land of corn and field of dreams. So again, this is Bourbon Over Headlines. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that jazz. Also, my wife, Jackie, has two channels. One's called Moondog Tarot. The other's called The Divine 222. They're both tarot channels. Moondog, the first one, does all the tarot signs. Reads from Aquarius, Pisces, Sagittarius, Scorpio, all of the above. Gemini, whatever. The Divine 222 is just for Pisces. Just for those people. We just exited Pisces seasons. I don't know what season's next. I don't do those channels. That's my wife. This is me. I drink bourbon. Tell you what's going on in cities in the U.S. in the 1920s. We'll get to the 30s eventually, but right now I'm concentrating on the 20s. So as I said, this is Council Bluffs, Iowa. So let's begin, shall we? So in 1855, they changed their name from Canesville. Canesville. I'd take Council Bluffs over Canesville too. I would. They were the 5th largest rail center in the country. We'll explain why in a minute. In the 1920s. And I think they're still a pretty good rail center today. So the population in 1920 is 36,000. So let's just say 36, I think, to about 40,000 in the decade. Today it's 62,000, 63,000. As of the last count, which I think Iowa does a census every 5 years in the state, besides the national census. So I think that's from 2025 or 2024. So it's doubled in 100 years. It's not too bad. So now, one of the first, not the first, but one of the first radio stations, because we're in the 1920s. We're in the beginning of the golden age of radio. I've done this on a couple other episodes. K Oil. Again, west of the Mississippi, it's a K. Alright. Began broadcasting July 10th, 1925. It is still on the air today. So, just got done with the 10th anniversary. Now, something unique about this station is in 1928, it participated in the first CBS network radio broadcast. Now, I don't know what you know about radio, but radio, back then and still now, they like sort of like a TV. Like every local area has its own CBS affiliate. It's part of the CBS network. You might get national programming, you get your local news, you get like that. So they did that with the radio back in the day too. So the first ever CBS, which takes place in New York. CBS was in New York. It's one of the first one to ever get a radio license. First 1928 first network, so it had branched out enough where I got licenses and agreements with enough radio stations to do a network broadcast in 1928. Now, can anyone guess, just off the top of your head, why is it called K-O-I-L, or it's not coil, it's K-Oil? Anyone guess why? The original people who owned it was an oil company. An oil company owned it to begin with, so it got the initials. And this is when they could sort of pick their call signs, because there was enough there to pick. Can't pick K Oil anymore because it's already there. So next on the agenda is, okay, so in the 1860s, 1850s, 1870s, up until probably, I would say, the 1930s, a lot of stuff, even into the 1950s where we got the interstate system, a lot of stuff, and it is to today, but back then especially, a lot of freight, a lot of grain, a lot of that was done by rail. Now, in the early days, railroads, you had off spurts, you had Louisiana lines, and the East Coast had a lot more railroads than the West Coast, or West part, because it was established first. New York, Boston, Philly, all those, Chicago, all those were established cities They all were connected, whether it was by water or by rail. So, in the 1860s, 1863, they wanted to do a transcontinental railroad, connect the entire country by rail. So this stuff, so now transportation that used to take weeks, now it takes days. I think it went from 3 weeks to 3 days when this line was completely filled to transport something from this point. Council Bluffs was the official starting point of the Transcontinental Railroad. So Council Bluffs is on the Missouri River. So the Missouri River, they built a bridge over it, train bridge, connected it there, boom, then we went west. Okay, it was completed in 1869. 1863 to 1869. Reason why it took 6 years was, there's kind of a war going on from 63 to 65 called the American Civil War. So labor pools were kind of sparse. A lot of people fight. Now, there were 3 lines, 3 railroad companies that did this. Okay, 3 companies. Oh, and by the way, it was 1,911 miles of railroad line, the entire Transcontinental Railroad. 1,900 miles. That's a lot of railroad. A lot of railroad line. So 3 companies: the Western Pacific, the Central Pacific, and then Union Pacific. Okay, all laid. Now the Western and the Union laid a lot more line than the Central. The Central was the one that laid the least. Okay, all right. My bad. From months to weeks. It cut it from, my bad. In my notes, cut the tower time from months to weeks. So it cut it from like several months to 1 week to take stuff on trail. So all that corn, all that grain from that area, you could transport it across the country in a week now. All that stuff could go in a week. So a little interesting, I thought, is so states and the government, they help subsidize this, saying we're going to let you, because it's a huge outlay to lay this kind of line. So they said we'll pay you so much for certain types of line. So $16,000 or $573,000 per mile of line for flat areas. So all those Great Plains out there, $32,000 or $1.14 million per mile of line for foothills. So, and the $48,000 back then to $1.7 million for mountains per mile. Per mile, these companies got paid to play this line down. That's a lot of money. If I did a mile, let's say you're gonna pay me $1.7 million to lay a mile of road, guess what? I'm getting that mile done quickly. So I can do the next mile, the next mile, the next mile. You're paying me bank. So interesting also is because this was going on during the American Civil War, and the farther west you went at this point, there weren't as many states, there were territories. So Brigham Young, yes, that Brigham Young University, founder of the Mormon Church, or the Church of Latter-day Saints, if you want to call it that, supplied many of the men and supplies and stuff for building. He had bought a small interest in one of the railroads. So, and it helped with this because they were out in Utah, so stuff could get quicker, people could travel quicker to Utah to help create Utah as a bigger place. So, I try to find the mayor of the town I'm doing. Trying to find a mayor or something about something with the politics. Just gloss of, like, I don't care what Republicans are, just who is the mayor during this time frame, because that's sort of like something that grounds you. Well, what's interesting is all my research, and I researched newspapers.com, other websites. I went on the Iowa History Council Bluffs official website, Iowa State website. Couldn't find a listing of mayors from 1920 to about 1935, which is interesting because that's the time of Prohibition. Coincidence? Probably a coincidence, but I just found it funny that during the Prohibition time, the time of Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, We couldn't find a list of mayors in Council Bluffs. Were they rotating that quickly? That was just boom, 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 when we get done, whatever? I don't know. I don't know what was happening in Council Bluffs in the 20s. I do a little bit, but not on that level. I didn't live there. I wasn't alive yet. But that being said, speaking of Prohibition, and speaking of that, Clark Zoller, Z-O-L-L-E-R, of Davenport, which is near, it was in the paper, was arrested by the feds, the federal government, probably the Treasury Department, which I think they were the ones that handling Prohibition at that point, was fined, arrested and fined $1,500 total, and had to close his business for brewing beer. Now this guy owned a drink store. He owned a store that sold stuff, dry goods, sodas, stuff like that. He did that. So, see, fined $1,500 for brewing beer. All right, sounds like a plan for me. $1,500 doesn't sound like a lot today, but back then, as I said, they were laying $16,000 a mile, which is $573,000 back then. That's in the 1860s. So I'm sure $1,500 was a good chunk of change. Probably sold his store, closed it, sold it, and took the money for that. So instead of arresting him, they fined him and made him close the store. I guess that's better than jail time. Don't you agree? I guess it is better than jail time. So today there's a lot of talk about work ethic, modern generation not working as well, and every generation go rags and razzes the generation that's after them about this or that, whatever. But what I found interesting, again, these are small town papers. Council Bluffs, 36,000. That's not super small town, but the story says a teacher, now a school teacher. Now teachers are unique. They're around kids all the time. Okay, they're around kids. Kids, even people, but kids tend to carry germs. They tend to get sick. They tend to rub their noses and wipe in places you can't control. Couldn't find out what type of school it was, elementary, whatever, but this teacher misses her first 2 days of school as a teacher in 43 years. So she's been a teacher for 43 years and only misses 2 days. That's better than some of the kids who went there. I'm sure some of those kids missed 2 days in like their first week. It's the first week of school. Nothing happens. Why are you missing 2 days? But despite that, and she just didn't teach during school time. She was a music teacher from what I gathered because she taught boys and girls, which back in the 20s was saying something because this was still a time where a lot of times there was just still boys, girls, girls, schools in this time. She taught boys and girls after school and during vacation. So during summer vacation, probably spring break, whatever, maybe her vacations, taught them music because she was an accomplished musician also, which is great. I wish all teachers were like this. They showed up every day. They taught the kids. They cared enough. They said, this is my interest. I'm going to teach you after school. There was no issue with scandals, anything like that. This teacher seemed to be a solid person who just showed up every day for 43 years and only missed 2 days after 43 years. I want her immune system, by the way. I guess we're just built differently back then, people. So, of course, doesn't tell me the age, but that's so. So now on the other end of the spectrum, we have a teacher, very studious, teaches kids on the side, music and everything. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the criminal element. Maybe they needed this teacher to show them the way, and to tell them that they didn't need to go thieving cash registers. Now, usually when you go into a store, maybe not so much today because we're becoming more and more of a cashless society, but back up until I would say even 20 years ago, beginning of the 2000s, maybe even the mid-1990s, you went to like certain areas, certain stores, you knew they had cash. Really the only place that's cash I would say would be a bank maybe, or maybe a marijuana dispensary. Even they would take credit cards. But cash. But back down in the 20s, they had silver coins, silver dollars. Silver was a valuable commodity like it is today. So these thieves stole the cash register. So they apparently couldn't get into the register. Now, these are 1920s cash registers. I don't know how many of you have seen an old movie or seen any old like general store reprops or general store stuff. These are these big clunking cash registers that you hit the button and it comes up in the window. It owns you $1 with the little, the buttons that you have to like physically push. It isn't like you scan it. You're like, oh, this is like this, and you hit 1, 2, 5, and it pops up as 1, 2, 5 in the window of the cash register. These are the big hulking cash registers from the 20s. They stole this thing. So I'm gonna let you guess how much. Think to yourself. 1920s. How much do you think was in this cash register that they stole? $1 to $3 in silver. $1 to $3. Think about that. $1 to $3 in silver. $1 to $3. You did all that work for $1 to $3. Now, in this store, people around the store, other store owners, other store people had seen two suspicious characters. I was saying suspicious characters loitering around the store, and these were the two thieves. It doesn't say they caught them, but I'm pretty sure they did, because back then it's hard to hide a cash register. These are the big clunking things. I think these are the. So now, as we all know, it's March Madness, people. I don't know who you're rooting for. Iowa, I think, was in the tournament. Maybe, I don't know. I think I was in the tournament. I wasn't following this year, so it snuck up on me. But I know the Big 12's got teams in the tournament. So, your story about the growing popularity of college basketball. It says here that this is 1923, that attendance in the Big Ten, which until recently had 10 schools, but it's called the Big Ten, was going to go over 1 million for college basketball. Now, this is before March Madness. This is before anything else. This was just college basketball. I think the NIT was around. But first time they were predicting 1 million attendees for the whole conference. There are schools that reach close to that today. If you count everything else, I don't know, 20,000. You play 15 games. You might get that. I'm sure there are conferences that get 2 or 3 million easily. SEC, Big 12, Big 10. So they get 2 or 3 million people attending games easily. You count all the Big 10 games, But I found that funny that this is like college basketball, which I've done a lot of stories about local basketball, like YWCA, high school, Christian leagues. This is the first story about college basketball and its growth. And it says here in the story that they don't think it will reach or rival college football in popularity. Maybe in certain circles it has. It's surpassed it. I definitely know now in March Madness it's more popular. College football isn't going on, but there are people who are just college basketball fans, there are people who are just college football fans, and there are people who are just fans for the college. I know people who are just like every sport in that college. I know people who go to the gymnastics, the softball, every sport you can think of. They'll go to tennis. They'll watch the tennis team. Okay, and this is when you actually had to go to the games or listen to them on the radio. You couldn't watch them on TV. You couldn't get the SEC network, Big Ten network. You actually had to physically go to the games. So saying it's going to surpass the million, that's a feat for back then. So one last story before I go on to notable people from Council Bluffs. Found a story which is about juries. Now, not a specific jury, just as 5 women jurors. So the county, back then this county, had a list of 30 jurors, I guess, for all its trials, because there weren't that many. It's a small county. There were 5 women jurors. Now, you have to remember, this is 1923. The woman just got the right to vote in 1920. So this is really the first time women are starting to be allowed to do a lot of things in that process. Be jurors, be members of the jury. Because in some places, it was like, now it's, I think, your DMV records, but back then it might have been who, if you could vote, you could be on a jury. Each place is a little different. Mostly it's DMV records, but even then they excluded women from juries. Really couldn't do that now that they had the right to vote. Because, well, I can vote, but I can't be on a jury. I'm going to vote you out so I can be on a jury. So, but this county has 30 jurors. 5 of them are women. Now, they put the women's names in the paper. I don't necessarily agree with that. But this is the 1920s. The press is a little different in how they reported stories back then. But it is what it is. Now, a couple people who either were born here, lived here, did significant things here, or did significant things that either worked here or whatever. I got 2. Found 2. One is Gene Okerlund. Yes, Mean Gene Okerlund from WWE, WCW, WWF fame. The famous interviewer and announcer, Mean Gene Okerlund. He, after graduating college at the University of Nebraska, got a job as a disc jockey at, you guessed it, K-Oil, the radio station in Council Bluffs. He did that for several years and then moved on. Well, funny thing about Mean Gene Okerlund, though, and I learned this, he has an album out there. He recorded an album and had a song. I don't have it on me. I think it's called Gene and the Waves or something. I don't have it on me. I wrote it down. It's on a different sheet of paper. But there's a song with Mean Gene Okerlund singing. I'm frankly surprised Vince McMahon didn't exploit this and realize he had a musical genius on his hands and made Mean Gene Okerlund sing at some point. But that's neither here nor there. Also, John Lieber, who was a Major League pitcher, late 1990s, early 2000s, I think 2011 was his last year, somewhere in there. Played for several teams, Cubs, Phillies, off the top of my head. But I think he played for 5 or 6 teams when it was all said and done. Solid starter, made a lot of money because he played professional sports. So, in conclusion, that's Council Bluffs. Hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the city, learning about what stories were going on in there. Again, cars starting to happen, so just to add a bonus story for you. Someone had a car accident because ever since there's been cars, there's people who can't drive the car. So, also so there's people who can't drive cars. Also, people who can't drive cars. It was a Ford, it looks like, with a Ford Coupe. So this was the Model T era. So it's probably a Model T that hit him. Got hit by a Model T. Let's sue Henry Ford, people. Sue Henry Ford. But as I said, in conclusion, that's Council Bluffs, Iowa. So once again, this is Bourbon Over Headlines, where your headlines are so neat. So drink responsibly, and let's be neat out there.